Welcome, and it's just gone 7 p.m. Wednesday, the 24th of November, and you are watching episode 31 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight to issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, projects approval. Can we do better? Is my guest, Professor Allan Dale. Allan is a professor of the Tropical Regional Development at Cairns Institute, James Cook University, and is Chief Scientist for the Cooperative Research Centre developing Northern Australia. He is also a University Fellow with the Charles Darwin University, Northern Institute, and has strong interest in integrated social governance with a particular focus across the tropical world, Northern Australia and the Great Barrier Reef. Allan leads the JCU's contributions to Queensland's Rural Economy Centre of Excellence and Clean Growth Choices Program. The human dimensions of the Barrier Reef, Northern Development Agenda, and emerging approaches to collective impact. His extensive research and policy and expertise in building strong societal government systems, but particularly those related to systems in regional economic development, social development, and natural resource management. Allan is a member of the Federal Government's Advisory Group on Northern Australia Agenda. He also was previously the chair of the Regional Development Australia Far North Queensland and Torres Strait, Inc., the CEO of Terrain Natural Resources Management. He has held executive and management roles within the Queensland Department of Natural Resources and Mines and Department of Community Service. His global experience in respect to social impact of development. Allan is an ambassador of the Queensland Plan, 30-year vision for Queensland. He is also a major contributor to the recent Australian National University 500-odd page publication, Leading the North, Rethinking Northern Australia Development. Welcome, Allan.
G'day, Bill, and thanks for having us online.
It's greatly appreciated. If you could start off and tell us something about yourself, your misspent youth and childhood.
I'm a bit of an odd character, Bill, in that I've got sort of lots of different bits of history that sort of bring me to the way I think about some of the Northern development debate. I think part of that is my own sort of family background. So we're North Queenslanders really, because my old man Harry Dale sort of came through North Queensland on his way to the World War II campaign in New Guinea and Bougainville. So as you probably remember, those guys came through. They actually based in Cairns, did a lot of landing craft heavy training at Trinity Beach, and they then went up to Tablelands, did all their pre-training before they went off to Bougainville and to New Guinea. So I think that was the foundation of why we ended up in North Queensland. My old man just fell in love with the place. He was from Sydney, and actually we're a Queensland family, but he'd actually grown up in Sydney. And I think he really desperately wanted to get back to North Queensland after the war and out of Sydney as a place to live. So that's sort of the reason why we ended up here. He came back through here on his way to Korea during the Korean campaign, and then they went off to Malaya. So a lot of my family grew up in Malaya actually during the Malayan insurgency. So family of about 5 boys, bit of a big complex family. My mum kept trying for a girl, but didn't quite succeed. So at one level, I grew up because my father, in a place that my parents really loved, so dad came here because he absolutely loved North Queensland. He loved the remoteness of it, loved the remoteness of Northern Australia. And after 3 campaigns in PNG and New Guinea and Korea and Malaya, I think he pretty much just wanted to disappear into the bush. So much of my misspent youth was pretty much, we grew up at Trinity Beach, and much of my misspent youth was really in that country between Trinity Beach and Port Douglas, that fantastic set of hills and rolling country there, Irukandji country. We just spent lots of time out there fishing, walking and disappearing off the bush. So that's one aspect of my life, is that really deep appreciation, I suppose, of the landscape in Northern Australia. But another big part of my family is actually also in the agricultural business. So, we're way back on my mother's side from Tasmania, and the family from that side ended up as major pastoralists in central Queensland and other parts of northern Australia. So I've got a good, strong sort of sense of the development side of the agenda in the north. And I'm actually an agriculturalist by background, so so I've got a very strong sort of sense of why development's actually quite important right across northern Australia. And then finally,
of your other brothers, did they also stay here, or did they find greener
most of
pastures?
us are here, yeah. So we had quite unique Christmases, really, because at quite a long period of time over our lives, all of us worked and played in some part of northern Australia. So my oldest brother was search and rescue pilot and long-term pilot, probably the longest serving pilot in Cape York and Torres Strait, actually. So he worked a lot on the stations. He did the mail run in the Cape. So he'd come home at Christmas, with lots of stories from that role. And the second brother was in the fisheries industry, so he's in the Gulf trawler industry. So he'd spend most of his life up around Daru and down in the Gulf. Then the third one was actually the last forester in North Queensland. So you remember when World Heritage came and the forestry industry closed down? Well, he was actually the last of the official government foresters at that time during that process. And the final one was a miner. So he's been off in exploration, largely right across the north, but pretty much in that Western Cape, sort of right down across to Central Australia and over in the northwest as well. So yeah, they're all been different parts. 3 of us are here now, 2 somewhere else, but we all pretty much refocus our attention when we come home for Christmas.
Well, from their work history, it's obviously they would have actually bore the brunt or seen a lot of regulation changes that affected the industries and their ability to make a good living in that. I mean, the fishermen have issues now with the commercial fishermen, with the quotas and all that sort of stuff. As you say, the forestry is already sort of closing down. A couple of weeks ago, we had Mark Venasaic from New South Wales on. He was chairing the sustainable forestries in New South Wales and the pressure they're up to under for curtailing activities similar to what's already happened into Victoria. So obviously, and anyone who's been in agriculture would have also faced additional regulation over the past couple of decades to deal with. So they've been at the forefront, and you would have got all the background stories on it.
Yeah, well, that sort of period from the 70s pretty much to the end of the century, Bill, that experience across all of my family members in different industries and different parts of the business of Northern Australia, that really actually inspired me to put together that book I wrote in 2014, Beyond the North-South Culture Wars. And that book sort of came about because I'm sort of passionate about Northern Australia. We're all North Australians, or at least regional Australians in the Queensland context across your audience, and so we all live in those places because we love them for a whole heap of reasons, but particularly because of the life that these places give you. It's an incredible life, and this landscape, it's a very diverse and beautiful and largely undeveloped landscape. So there's great sort of passion that comes from that part of it. There's great passion from the many diverse industries we've got, from the sugar industry to the mining industry to the fishing industry, and we've got such an incredibly diverse sort of set of industries across the north. But the other part that I'm pretty passionate about is that we're still basically an Indigenous domain, so traditional owners across Northern Australia have got rights and interests now, post all of the reforms of the last 20 years, to around about 85% of the landscape. So we're in this place where there's this really special relationship or special opportunity to get the relationship between traditional owners and the mainstream Australian economy right. So the passion I've got for the place is if we get the tension between all 3 of those things right, I think this place has an incredibly powerful future. If we muck it up, then we're going to end up in a bit of a problem.
I think one of the most unique things about it, in regards to what you're talking about, the ability to have partnerships and that, is that 75% of the land is still actually Crown land. It's just leased. So the government does have an ability to have pathways to provide more participation on the land and if it got out of the way a bit, or encouraged maybe freehold land for Indigenous and other groups,
Yeah.
sort of thing. So that would probably be a good lightning rod to go forward. But I suppose the other thing is, we need development to hold on to our population. There's far too many. I do the ring arounds for people to come on this show, and it's surprising the number of people I ring up, Climate Council or this group down in Melbourne or even Sydney or Brisbane and that, and you strike people who, were Tunney, economist, founder for Adapt Research, economics, Townsville boy. You ring up someone down in the law department down Griffiths University, another Townsville boy. You ring up the Climate Council and talk to, and like Amanda Cahill at the Next Economy, Atherton girl.
Yep,
Like,
yep. We're all out there.
All these people with great skills have gone, and we need development and opportunity to hold the people we've got. And gee whiz, wouldn't it be great to get some of those people back in our landscape, doing the governance and that you're talking about? Because a lot of those people, like Jean Tunney and that, have worked in the federal government sphere in economics and treasury and stuff like that. So there's a massive skill set of people who have come from northern Queensland and central Queensland, who have gone off, but there's no chance of them coming back unless there's a dynamic economy here. And that dynamic economy is not going to come about unless there is development, that's not only in agriculture, but industry processing that. And I know we both live and we like Cairns and things like that, but gee, I am so over the tourist industry, like, give us a break. There's something more than the tourist industry. You would think after the pilot strike, the Japanese downturn, the Asian downturn, the GFC, and now COVID, that we would sort of
it's an important part of the mix, but you've got to get a bit of depth into the economy, eh?
Yeah, that's right. So, so anyway, if we could just go on to a couple of content. Maybe the first thing we can just touch on is the Queensland plan and the 30-year vision, and how you got involved with that, and how that relates to northern Queensland. And then we can move into the governance and that you're looking forward into the future. And basically, what's supposed to happen, what is happening, and what can be improved to make it what it should happen. If you can see the quantitative difference that I'm getting at.
Yeah, I'll unpack that all a little bit, Bill, because it sort of means all the layers have got to work for the whole system to work. The whole planning system's got to work, right from that Queensland plan level right down to local government plans and development approvals that go with it at the project level. So my interest in a lot of the northern development agendas at the moment is how do we get that system right? Because I'm quite concerned that we don't quite have that planning and development approval system right. And if you're sitting in Melbourne or Brisbane or Sydney and you want to make an investment in one of those large areas there's three things that sort of exist that are really clear that give you the signal that you can invest and you get on and do it. And the three things tend to be, there's a clear plan of some kind, let's say, the land use plan for Brisbane or whatever the case may be. There's quite clear infrastructure plans that sort of sit behind that sort of say, well, you can expect these bits of infrastructure, these services to sort of flow on. And generally, all of that is occurring in the context of freehold land. So there's not that much complexity about the title associated with it. So that's one of the reasons city economies do so well, is that the framework for investment, the sorts of basic things that people need to invest with a bit of certainty, is relatively clear. The moment you get outside of the southeast Queensland sort of boundaries, with the exception of downtown Cairns and downtown Townsville, Mackay, Rocky, Darwin, that's not how the rest of North Australia works. It's a relatively contested landscape in the sense of what's the future vision for these places, and where should we see development occur, where should we not see it occur, under what conditions should we see it occur. And that complexity makes it incredibly difficult for anyone who's got an investment interest, whether it's renewable energy or whether it's agriculture or whether it's something more in the tourism space, whatever the case, without that planning, mining, whatever the case it is, it's incredibly difficult to be able to poke your nose into that landscape and resolve all of the complex tensions, which are not just local tensions, they're generally national tensions, you know. So yes, North Australia is one of the best environmental landscapes in the world. So it's of national importance, it's of international importance. Yes, there is massive development opportunity in all of those sectors that we just talked about. But again, where do we want that to occur, and what have we got to, that's right, what have we got to do to make that happen? And then traditional owners who've got rights and interests, well, interest across 100% of that landscape and rights across much of it, 85% to 90%. People are just coming out of that native title era, so they're only just in the position of starting to build their governance systems and planning systems to be in the business of developing and achieving their aspirations as well. So if you're a developer who's got an interest, whether you're sort of medium, small or large, when you poke your nose into North Australia, you're poking your nose into a very contested and unplanned environment with lots of tenure complexity as well. So it basically sort of says, well, the development agenda is essential. You were saying before, you know, look, actually even just holding population in North Australia is a hard job. And I can tell you, after 7 years at the helm of RDA, Funnels, Queensland Torres Strait, there is a day-to-day battle in this city around Cairns in this region to keep a bit of growth going, because if there's not that economic activity continuing to keep communities functioning, keep our city functioning, then basically we start losing population pretty quickly. It's a hard yakka to keep a little bit of growth and to keep things actually functioning. So when we've got a landscape that's incredibly contested, largely unplanned, and we've got a model of planning and development approval that sort of works for the city but doesn't work for the bush, there's three things that happen. So the first is we don't get investment, and that starts to give us an economic problem. The second thing that happens is we tend to get poor quality investment proposals, or we get investment proposals in the wrong place. So we end up in big fights about whether or not certain things should be protected or not protected, and that's very draining for our communities. And then finally, we see development quite often that doesn't sort of really partner local communities, particularly traditional owners, to get things right. So it's that complexity that I'd like to really focus, well, it's where I focus a lot of my policy and research work, and a lot of my advocacy work is to say, well, North Australia can't continue with this system not functioning. There's a great opportunity, but we're not going to make it if we don't start to do some very solid thinking about the future of the landscape, what we're wanting to achieve, where we want to achieve it, how we're going to achieve it, and then how we attract investment from the right sources. Is that right?
But don't you sometimes think that your job's a lot harder than it should be, because the public infrastructure investment should normally be there and is expected in Sydney, Melbourne and Southeast Queensland is there. But when it comes to our regions, we're still talking about things like water security. We're still talking about all-weather roads. We're all still talking about, well, let's get the connection from here to the Cape upgraded so it can be a proper commercial, economic and viable economy conduit from the Cape to Cairns through the tablelands. And it's not, and I mean, Cairns is going through the stage now that it's talking about 2026 is going to be in dire straits if it doesn't get something done about water. And it's talking about taking water out of the Mulgrave, which there's been a plan for the last 20 years, been sitting there, you know. And then you talk about Townsville, same problem. I mean, about 2 years ago, just before they got those big floods, they were down to this basically thinking about hauling water because they were down to 8% in the Ross River Dam, and we're talking about sediment. They were in a real bit of a problem there. And we've heard other things like up in Ravenshoe, the water's not drinkable at sometimes, other towns. So that basic infrastructure, we shouldn't be lacking that, if you know what I mean. If that was there first, and it should be without any argument sort of thing, then we could get to where you want to go, the actual development of the region. But you think that failure or the, I don't know whether it's a failure or just lack of interest or lack of commitment to Central and North Queensland to get that basic public infrastructure right is a real problem?
Yeah, so this is where I'm interested in it from a governance point of view, you know. So there's a lot of reasons why, you know, we probably don't have the attention on the planning that we need to have done to actually, you know, both attract the private sector investment, but also to get those basic foundations in place. And yes, it is about numbers, you know. So I think there's a lot of work to be done for the state to increasingly recognise that regional development and getting your regions well developed and established is quite crucial to the economy of the state as a whole. So there's actually an economic reason why you wouldn't focus all of your attention just in southeast Queensland for high quality land use and infrastructure planning, that you've really got to step out into the bush to make that happen as well. Because ultimately the strength of the whole economy will rest on the relationship between the region and the city. Right? So there's, in my view, a strong economic argument about why you wouldn't leave the regional part of Queensland as just a fairly unplanned landscape. So that's the first thing. But at the same time, I'd also say that there's big responsibility on us as North Australians or regional Queenslanders to make the system work better for us. And I'll give you one example of where I think we've tried this and it's actually worked relatively well. So you mentioned the Peninsula Development Road before, you know, that access road effectively between Mareeba and Weipa and onto Northern Peninsula area and Torres Strait. People in Cape York absolutely know how important that is, not just from an economic point of view, but from a social point of view and from a cultural point of view as well.
I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, so to finish that story off, you may remember Trish Butler, who used to be part of Cape York Sustainable Futures. They worked hard over many years to present a really clear vision about getting that job done. But when I was in RDA, Far North Queensland and Torres Strait, I was pretty much in the business of trying to influence budgets for infrastructure for Northern Australia and for North Queensland in particular. And my view was that we could never really win that argument about infrastructure investment on 20,000 people. You know, so while people in Cape York had a legitimate, real interest to get this done, they weren't going to win it on a votes basis. So that meant Cairns had to really be behind Cape York. And I very strongly argue that Cairns' economy is a genuinely regional economy. So what's good in Torres Strait is good for Cairns, and what's good for Cairns is good for Cape York or the Gulf, you know. So firstly, you sort of got to start then talking about the 250,000 people that rely on that infrastructure, and that starts to bring your numbers up. But we started getting together all four RDAs across North Queensland, Central Queensland, you know, North Queensland and the Mackay-Whitsunday region. We all started talking about, well, what is it that really unites us? Well, it's actually this great bit of infrastructure, the Bruce Highway, which comes through from the south right through to Cairns. My view is it actually keeps going up to Weipa. You know, maybe it's not called the Bruce, but it does. Now, we took a long, hard haul approach on this where we had a very united vision. And you've got to remember that means a million people making this argument now as opposed to 20,000 in Cape York. So we partnered with the state. We made sure local government was strongly behind us. And we worked with the state to make sure that the state and the feds both were doing joint planning. We developed a thing called the North Queensland strategy that sort of positioned this really strongly. And with the state commitment of about $1 billion into the Bruce, we were able to sort of see that lever eventually around about 8.7 billion into the Bruce and to the Cape York system. So coming out of that came the first tranche of 250,000, 260,000 into Cape York's Peninsula Development Road and the access roads into the communities. We've held very strongly that that needs to be governed in partnership with the community. So I still chair the Cape York Infrastructure Package Group. And that's developed a model, I think, that's actually proven the value of this type of investment. And that meant the second tranche of investment actually happened. And it's now the second round of 200 million plus. And the stages 3 and 4, in my view, are relatively assured into the future because we've got a really good collaborative model. Now, I say to people in Cape York, that wouldn't have happened had we not had Townsville and Rockhampton and Cairns and Mackay behind us. So while we can complain a bit about, oh, the system doesn't deliver, and I think there's a lot of value in the state getting its act together to do it properly, we can, I think, have a much stronger voice in making sure that that does actually happen. And that Cape York example, Peninsula Development Rate example, just gives you a bit of a sense of how I think we can do that type of thing.
I think there's a lot of examples. There's corridors, like obviously Cairns to the Cape is a corridor.
Yeah.
Townsville to Mount Isa is a corridor. Then you've got Rockhampton out to Emerald is another corridor. Mackay Isaac's actually an enclosed area. You never had a rail development out, took it out, whereas Cairns actually had a rail development out. Townsville has, Rockhampton had, but Mackay never had that rail development, so it just it's that inclusive area there.
Yeah.
But we do have these corridors, and for too long we've seen these corridors wither. You know, Julia Creek, Richmond, Hewington, that sort of corridor. The numbers of people come down. Maybe it started off, of course, after the mechanisation of farming and that, and agricultural vehicles, and you didn't need that sort of labour-intensive part of it. But the other thing is that should have been replaced by other developments. And like you say, if Cairns wants to grow, it needs Mareeba to have a good economy. It needs Atherton to have a great economy. It needs development up in Chillico. It needs to go up. Okay, the same for Townsville. It needs that corridor development all the way through. And the thing is, if Cairns does well, Mareeba in that does well. They're all
Mareeba does well when Cairns does well.
So,
Exactly.
but the thing is, we don't have a lot of that cooperation. And I've got to take my hat off to you to get Cairns and Townsville working together. Kudos to you, because like the parochialism, I'm West Australian, and I've never seen parochialism that's so destructive as it is in Queensland. And
that's sad to hear from a West Australian, Bill.
We're different again, but the thing is, you know, we're different from the eastern staters, but we don't sort of say, well, I come from Bunbury and I won't have anything to do with people in Albany, and I come from Geraldton. We never had that sort of thing. But gee whiz, I've never.
I think there's sort of picture of
Queenslanders in Victoria or somewhere like that, and they say they basically don't talk to anyone who's in Cairns if they come from Townsville. It's real Australian, but so kudos to you to get them to work together.
Well, and this is the sort of cultural change I'm looking for, Bill, is this much stronger collaborative sort of approach, you know, and we've proven on things like the Bruce Highway and the Cape stuff that it can work, you know, but we've got to sort of start asking ourselves right across regional Queensland, what are the things we're better off working together on than separately, you know, and we pretty quickly would come to the conclusions, as we did in the Bruce case. Well, there's a couple of things we've got the same problem on. Let's work as a whole rather than as isolated regions or isolated cities. So I think that's a big part of
each other's backyard and say, oh, they've got stadium and we haven't got a stadium, and they're getting this and we're not getting that. You know, it's like a big game, you know, like it's a bit of envy. But like you say, something bigger than both. If you can get them focused on that, you might have a win. But what I'd like to move on in regards to governments is the Northern Territory example. Now, look, for me, it's a bit of a hard reading, that book, but I did have a bit of a
sorry about that book. That one's a bit more of an academic book, but the one I really would ask people to read is the one I did in 2014.
Well, maybe next time, but
very, very much about some of these more social issues. You know? So,
reading the thing on the Northern Territory, it seemed to suggest they've got their act a little bit together a bit more than us. Is that the truth of it, or they obviously still got problems, but they seem to be a bit
different governance challenges. You know, so I think the territory's probably been through a bit of a shock to its economy in the last 4 or 5 years. So it wasn't that long ago that the Northern Territory economy was looking pretty shaky. You know, and largely because this strategic work hadn't been done, And then, of course, COVID came. And what I've seen in the Northern Territory in the last 3 to 4 years is a much more strategic approach. You know, they took the response to COVID very seriously. They established some very high-level commissions to try to reform the economy and to try to make things work quite differently. We've been working through the CRC North Australia very strongly with the Northern Territory government about what will it take to change the planning arrangements and to get things done differently. So I've been really pleased to sort of see the Northern Territory stepping up to try to address these issues. And I think it's a long way before that economy is a secure economy that can function by itself. But it's certainly, I think, in a better state than it maybe was 3 to 4 years ago.
Well, just talking on that, with Northern Territory's only got about 250,000 people, and if I've talked to Bernard Sold in regards to separate states and what's a critical mass for independent state that's economically viable.
Yeah, this is one of my favourite topics.
And he basically just piped up the number: 1 million people. You need a base of 1 million people if you're going to deliver the services that a state's required to deliver. Of course, you've got to have policing, you've got health, education, all those sort of things. So you need a critical mass.
Can you see that, Bill?
Yep, we've got that.
Yeah, I brought that one up because we're starting to step into the conversations about governance reform or state level governance reform about Northern Australia, which whenever there's a conversation in the press about it's time to separate, become a separate state, or North Australian state, then usually that same week I'll get the phone call from the press as well about what do you reckon? So this is a bit of a regular cycle of a 3-yearly debate. And I always keep coming back to, if the governance system isn't working well, we're part of a federation, so West Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland, we're all part of the federation. And if the federation isn't working well, then simply just creating another separate state isn't going to fix the foundation of the problem, because we're still going to be part of the federation. So you may remember, every now and again, Jonathan Thurston gets recommended as the first president of Northern Queensland or Capricornia or whatever people want to call it. But I've generally got some quite serious concerns about economic viability of issues around separation. So it's not that it's not a legitimate conversation, and I fully understand people's frustration about the way the economy works and the way government relationships with regions work. So I tend to sort of want to try to go to what's the actual nature of the problem, and is there a way of fixing that through getting our system of government and governance right? And maybe the solution could be, at the end of the day, sort of separation. But there's a lot of work you'd want to try to get right first, because if you just fix the problem by creating a new state, then there's a very, very high likelihood the state will actually be in financial difficulty before you can say boo. So,
well, it's not as though some states aren't already in financial difficulty.
Well, that's right. And Northern Territory is a classic example. If Northern Territory suddenly becomes state material overnight, there would be a long, hard haul before that state actually become highly viable and able to function in its own right. So I'm really keen in the Northern Australian debate for us to be working towards much stronger collaborative federalism. And that actually means North Australians, right across from West Australia, right over to Northern Queensland, operating as a bit more of a block, so rather than just like the debate we had between Townsville, Cairns, Mackay and Rockhampton, is there value in Northwest West Australia, Northern Territory and Northern Queensland really working much more strongly together? And I actually believe there's a great value in us doing that, because many of the issues we face are very similar. A lot of the impediments to economic development or environmental management or Indigenous development are quite similar as well. It's probably better for us to actually, as a whole, be working much more collaboratively. But it would take a couple of things to make that work. Firstly, it would take all 3 jurisdictions having the one vision or one agreed vision that the development of Northern Australia, and I should define what I mean by development. When I talk about development, I actually mean something better, moving from where we are to something better. that could mean straight out economic development. It could mean better social outcomes. It could mean better education. It could mean getting our environmental assets looked after and protected. All of those things are better than they may be at the moment. But if we're going to achieve a real development outcome in Northern Australia, then we probably need to start seeing all three jurisdictions working together much more effectively and having a bit of a common vision. And the Commonwealth really partnering in very strong bilateral arrangements with the jurisdictions on these issues. Do you remember 2015, the Northern Australian Development Agenda came together when it was announced through the white paper? There was a bit of a step towards trying to get much stronger collaboration across the Commonwealth and three jurisdictions. They set up a strategic partnership between Prime Minister, Premiers and Chief Minister. There was a whole layer of ministerial approaches below that. That arrangement was only just starting to come into place. And I think it took a long time for it to start to get to function. But probably around about 2 or 3 years ago, about 2 years ago, actually, those arrangements became a little bit weaker and we've sort of gone away from that. That makes me deeply concerned that we're not going to see the cooperation needed across all three jurisdictions to make that system actually work, if that makes sense. So that's why I shared that Jonathan Thurston screen, just to have that debate about what's it going to take to make the development of the North work from a governance point of view. And while I think it's a good, healthy debate to be having the debate about separation, whether it's North Queensland or North Australia as a whole, we've got to balance that with, well, have we actually fixed the fundamental underpinning governance problems that we face? And would separation actually fix that? Minimum population numbers, probably not the most critical solution. It's how good is the governance system. That's what will drive development, not necessarily a critical mass population.
I think that one of the things is, but the state government still have to deliver all these services. So you do need a revenue base. You do need to have the amenity to attract the workforce to deliver those services. So population does come into it a little bit, but that's moving off the subject. What I'd like to talk about now is sort of the Indigenous partnership. Now, one thing touched in the book was the development, the Woodside development gas plant in Western Australia that didn't go ahead because of the collaboration with the Indigenous people. Although I'm a little bit across that incident because I've got people in Western Australia, but it wasn't so that the whole Indigenous group up there didn't want it. I think there was a lot of external influence that came into play, and there was different groups. But the end result was Woodside didn't go ahead and build that gas hub. It went for the offshore option. So there's several major losses. A, we didn't get the development. B, the Indigenous population didn't get any benefit. And C, we didn't get any opportunity to get gas reserves for national gas reserves from the project. So to me, that's a lose-lose-lose. Now, somehow we've got to do better in regards to getting developments that fit right. But the thing is, you've got to have development if you're actually going to create wealth and generate wealth for these communities. If things don't go ahead, well, then you're not going forward. How do we get the right project in the right place? And how do we bring these people together so they can see, all right, there is going to be some issues and some we've got to work through to satisfy everyone, but it can be achieved rather than say, hands in the air, we're walking out of here, we're gone.
So that example, Bill, was a good example of, remember I was saying before, if we get these tensions in the landscape right, and this is basically achievable by partnership, not by division and conflict, then we've got a great future on all those fronts that you mentioned. If we muck it up, we're going to have a boom bust economy. We're going to have quite significant rural and Indigenous community poverty, and we'll probably muck the asset up anyway, the environmental asset up anyway. So that's the bit I'd really like to focus in for the balance of the time we've got. And through the CRC North Australia, I've been really trying to unpack this issue very seriously in the last 18 months, working with all three jurisdictions, the Commonwealth, and many stakeholders, environment, agricultural, development oriented, and Indigenous. And it tends to come down to right across the North Australian landscape, there's 4 areas that I want to see reform in. And the first would be, let's have a bit of vision about what the future of North Australia looks like. So if we don't have that sense of vision and the sort of view about how all the bits of the economy could work and how they all link to each other and what's the key bits of infrastructure that are required to actually pull that off, the basics of what you were saying about energy security and about water security, digital connectivity that's absolutely required, the workforce planning that's actually required to make all these things happen. If we don't have a bit of a sense of vision of that, then every individual project has to run the gauntlet of a very contested landscape. And that project you mentioned is just one example of that. National players come to play, global players come to play, then the local conflict gets really conflated. If we don't have a sense of where we want things to happen and what we think it's going to look like, it's almost impossible for even large corporates to invest, let alone, and I want to stress this point, let alone that the vast majority of the North Australian economy is actually small to medium business. Right? So if large corporates find it really hard, it's extremely difficult, or even far more difficult, for the small to mediums to actually invest as well. So I think we've got to get that vision really clear, and that should be genuinely visionary. What's our relationship with Papua New Guinea, with the Pacific, with Timor and Indonesia? What's our relationship to the wider sort of Asian economy and communities? You know, we've got to have a much more outward-looking view of the future of Northern Australia, not just be looking to Canberra and to Brisbane or Perth or South Australia. So that's the first thing I'd say is, how do we get that bigger vision? And this is where I want to see this much stronger cooperation between the federal government and the 3 jurisdictions. Then when we pick where we want this to happen, so let's say in the Gilbert River of Far North Queensland, we've got allocated around about 464 gigalitres of water for ag development, but there's no regional or local planning or development area planning that says this is the model of development that we think is acceptable. This is where in the landscape we think it's going to be right. This is the infrastructure that we're going to supply. And this is the relationship and Indigenous agreements that we need to have in place to get the tenure resolved. If that doesn't happen, then even getting that broad scale vision stuff won't make any difference either. Right? So we've got to get that local planning right. And under Commonwealth and state legislation, there is every opportunity to do that well. We don't have a lack of legislation to do it well. We actually have an implementation problem. Then at the layer below that, this is the area I'm historically very engaged with, because I used to be the social impact regulator in Queensland. So it used to be my job to get every major development in Queensland to talk properly to its communities. This was back in the 90s. And when I started that job, most companies just had no sort of skills base to actually work in partnership with their communities, you know, to get the relationship structured, to work through and genuinely identify the conflicts or the opportunities that they've got ahead of them, and to actually come up with solutions that are partnership based and for the life of the project. So we've got to change the way, the culture of how we do development approval, assessment and approval. And in my view, that means getting back to driving a sort of sense of strong partnership between the developer and the local community. And I'm happy to share my advice to communities about when a development comes to town and you're not happy with it, or you are, what are the sorts of things you should really be trying to see embedded in your relationship with that development? And then the final part of it is we've actually got to lift capacity of developers to be better at doing this. And I don't just mean the large corporates. There's a lot of work that continues to need to be done there. But let's say old mate wants to put a couple of boards in on their property west of Cunnamulla, you know, west of Georgetown or something like that. You know, there's not a lot of capacity out in the industry sector to get quality development applications coming in. And that means a lot of development applications that probably should happen actually aren't getting approved because the quality of the application is not that good. So they're the 4 areas I'm really interested in, Bill. You know, how do we get that bigger vision? And because we don't have that from North Australia, it's just a contested landscape. We've got to then focus in, got to do that land use planning, infrastructure planning, tenure resolution at the place level, whether it's conservation outcomes we're after or development outcomes. Then we really got to get that development approval process different and much more about partnership for long-term, cradle to grave from the start of the project to the finish. And then finally, we're going to lift the capacity of the development industry to get that right, but also lift and support the capacity of communities to respond to development so they get good outcomes from their point of view as well. So I spent a lot of my time in my role as somebody at the university. I see it's my job to stand out there and support anybody who's in this business, whether it's from the development industry, the conservation sector, Indigenous communities, to get better outcomes from development. This is why I sort of play in the public policy space around these issues. If we don't get them right, we're going to have a very sad economy, and we'll probably lose the crown jewel environmental assets, and we'll have Indigenous disadvantage. If we get it right, all of that could be the other way around. You know, strong regional economies, deeply inclusive economies where the people who might generally not get benefit from development get real benefit, and potentially even better environmental outcomes than we've got at the moment if we get it right.
Well, that lies primarily in the public sector, private sector elements and their developments and that.
Yep.
I still have an issue. We've got a department. I think it's regional development and management and whatever.
Yep.
And you would think they would be driving the vision ahead for things like the Coranda Range Road, because that's a natural progression of far North Queensland's economy. You would think they would be looking at Burdekin Dam Stage 2, putting the wall up 14 metres that was originally posed at Stage 2 when the thing was first built. But we don't seem to have that state push with that basic infrastructure. And if people haven't got the confidence that the state is going to deliver that basic infrastructure to be there for when they build their project, you know, like the water security, electricity security, the all-weather roads and all those sort of things, you think that's something we have to look at first, or at least make sure that's in place and that vision's occurring, so these people who come to invest large amounts of money in various private enterprise projects have the confidence, well, all that infrastructure will be in place by the time I want to move something on the road, process some minerals or whatever. You still think there's a need for them Brisbane to drive some of these things to make sure they happen. I mean, they can build a $7 billion tunnel underneath the Brisbane River, but that's not going to create any new wealth. That's not going to grow the pie. They spend $7 billion in regions, there's a much better chance of growing the pie.
Yep.
And that's the critical thing going ahead, especially when you've got massive debts like the Commonwealth debts up in the state debt. We need to grow that pie if we've actually got to pay down these debts and attract more business.
So, I think the 4 things I mentioned before, they're the heart of a lot of the advocacy work and the policy work I do, with strong research evidence behind it, Bill, is that we've got to get those 4 layers that we talked about, we've really got to get them working much better. And at the regional scale, that means the model that we have at the moment is largely regional communities working hard to try to get a vision, but it's very difficult because nobody's actually resourced in the regional community properly to do that. So councils, they haven't got the money. You know, councils do the best they can. Groups like Advanced Cairns or the RDA, they're all little bits of investment to try to pull that together. But it's not a serious investment in supporting the regional community to have a very clear vision. I know RDA, Far North Queensland, Torres Strait at the moment is starting to really try to bring all of that together into a much more cohesive agenda going forward. But they're doing that on the back of a smell of an oily rag,
Right.
you know, and I think what we've tended to have all of our regions in Queensland and across the West, it's tended to be more a project advocacy agenda. So we bring it together, we decide a couple of projects and we go down and lobby. Now, to me, that's more like a cargo cult sort of cycle where we get stuck just chasing the cargo. What's the next bit of cargo? I think we've actually got to change that relationship from strengthening up that sort of cooperation in the region to really get our act together in terms of, let's say, Far North Queensland, Torres Strait as a regional economy. What's the vision? What does that look like? Where's the ag that we really want to sort of see develop and the water security that's required? What are the big ticket infrastructure items that are going to make it happen? How do we really get ourselves out of deep poverty and unemployment in Cape York and Torres Strait? So we've got to get that strength of vision. Now, my view is rather than that just turning into a list of projects we go down and lobby for, it's got to turn into a very strong relationship with the state. So not an advocacy ask, but a partnership with the state that gets driven back into the formal land use plans and infrastructure plans of state government. So we've got those legislative opportunities to do that, but we don't use them very strongly and very effectively. And that should be at the heart of actually being very strongly influential in cabinet and in budget review committees. Now, if we get that right, that means we can partner with the feds. And the feds are major investors. You know, in the context of major roads in Queensland, it's usually an 80-20 split or 50-50 in some cases. If we've not got all three of those layers of governance right, you can expect us just to keep running down to Canberra, running down to Brisbane and chasing projects. So the cultural shift I'm looking for is how do we really come together as a regional community, genuinely integrate social, economic, environmental issues, cultural issues, but partner the state. And we're all in the business of trying to leave a federal investment. And I want to make a final point that all of this is about land use planning and infrastructure planning and tenure, because that's what drives private sector investment. So a lot of our thinking is about getting public sector infrastructure, but much more of it needs to be thinking about what is it that takes the confidence required to get the private sector to invest. And we've got major opportunities in the transition of the global economy to the zero net emissions agenda. This region is a standout region for investment opportunity. There is massive global capital interested and small to medium capital in this place, but we don't have the planning arrangements right yet. That means that capital is probably going to start looking in other places if we don't fix it. So that's my view. Is we've really got to sort of change the culture of how we do that. That means changing culture regionally. It means changing culture in the way the state works with regions. But it also means getting much stronger bilateralism between the state and the feds. The final point I'd make about that is I think it's quite positive that we've actually now got that Department of Regional Development, Manufacturing and Water. You know, I think that'll start to bring a stronger conversation around these things within government. It's only just started though, very new department.
Right. The thing that I'm sort of looking at is that you think we're talking as though the state government isn't part of us. You know, but we aren't part of the state government. Yes, and that's starting to. That's a bugbear. We're all Queensland, and they should be driving it.
Yeah. Can I just touch on that, Bill? Yeah, that's one of the things I often say is that it's as though we view the state as a region. We view the state as something different. But the state is us. You know, we are the state, and we are the Fed. We are the nation. You know, so this definitely shouldn't be about our region and we just go and lobby. It's got to be a partnership between us as a region with our state, pull all our state members into the tent, you know, and there's good cooperation across the state members here, but, you know, we've got to really bring them together as part of that partnership and that partnering with the feds, you know, so it's
the other thing you've got to look at too is there's 93 members of parliament, right? There's 73 within 250 kilometres of Brisbane, and the other 20 is scattered across West Queensland, Central Queensland, and North Queensland.
Yep.
So, come the last review, we went from 89 seats to 93 seats. 4 additional seats were made in Southeast Queensland. another review in 2023 before the 24 election with a review. And we're going to be in the same situation. There's going to be nearly 550,000 voters at population added to Queensland. Of that, there's going to probably be about 350,000 additional voters that have got to go into the system. Quotas, electoral quotas will have to go up. Boundaries will have to change. But we could be looking at a situation where the members from North and Central Queensland going into the tent will probably go down from 17 to 15 or something like that. Then you go another 10 years and you'll walk in the tent with 10 people. Like if you look at New South Wales, there's only 10 seats, 10 state seats west of the Great Divide. So if you think the state government isn't looking after you now, I can't see how they're going to really focus on anything north of Gympie in the future, unless there's big dollars in it for being pumped into Brisbane. And there was an article in today's paper with McFarlane giving a bit of a breakdown of the economy generated in Central and North Queensland and what it adds to the economy. Now, to me, the state government has to start seeing that the pie is up here to grow, Central Queensland, North Queensland, and start really growing that pie and get really invested in us. So it works both ways. But I do take some sort of consolation in, like, speaking to the people from the Hewitt and Irrigation Project.
Yeah,
I mean, they did what normally has to be done. They had to go and lobby for it. They had to come up with the plans. They had to bring in consultants. They had to get all the expertise and then go with the plan to get the money. And that seems to get off the ground. But it is a pretty inefficient way of doing it, especially when you'll just have a series of...
I'll talk about that one as a bit of an example, because I really like the HIPCO proposal. And you're probably aware also of the 15-mile development that's being done in that country, a little bit to the east there as well, by council there. I'm seeing some great project initiatives about water development right across that sort of, that corridor route between Townsville and Mount Isa, right, and out to Cloncurry. The problem is, if every one of those proposals went ahead, the Flinders River would be over allocated by many times, right? So while there's great effort to come up with really good projects in each of those individual communities, when you start adding all of them up, there's actually more projects than there is water to be allocated. And it's another reason why we've really got to have a regional, a whole of catchment view in that case about what's the development vision, and there's real opportunity there. That's
what I was alluding to. We'll just have these series of, something up Lakelands, we'll have something over here or something. No great coordinated projects that make sure everything's done right. And if it's going to be continual things like Gooden does this and Flinders does that, and then Richmond and Julia Creek do this, and then Lakelands, well, it's just a big hodgepodge if you don't have some real solid.
You're onto the heart of it, Bill. They're the big things that
it's certainly really annoying. And the thing is, it's not going to happen if the control keeps coming out of Brisbane. Somewhere along the line, the control has to move up to here.
Yeah.
Get the budgets, the allocation, the engineering, the planning, and everything up on site, because obviously you might live over the beaches area, and you're just going to have the enjoyment of a new $160 million bypass, and see how well that fits from Brisbane's planning, when the school year starts next year, and see how $150 million worth of main roads infrastructure planning is going to improve your life, not.
I live up a Speewah, Bill, so I'm more a Grand Range.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, you'll just have to put up with the Barron Bridge being sort of.
That's right. That's right.
So, it still must be galling for people on the tableland that there's no forward planning for a better conduit from Port of Cairns to the tablelands and onwards.
Yeah.
So how do we get? How do we get this governance to concrete?
So I sort of work at all levels on this problem, right? So I spend a lot of time within regions like ours, actively working and supporting the sort of conversation to come together into that bigger vision. And I'm seeing a bit of cultural change in this region. I am seeing much higher level of desire to work together. I think the fact that we've got two regional organisations or councils, Torres and Cape Indigenous Councils Alliance and FNQ Rock, they're getting much more strategic and working together much more. I think we've got to keep working at strengthening up that regional vision. Creative Range is a classic story about why we need to do that, right? So if we just plan for Cairns, we're not going to think about what do we do about tablelands. If we just plan for Mareeba, we're not going to really think about that whole transport agenda. So I've been on the public record about what I think is required in relation to fixing that problem. If we don't have a bigger vision of what the region looks like and how it should be structured and where the development opportunity is, then nobody's going to say the Creative Range makes sense because there's no vision of what we're trying to achieve. So we've got to get that partnership stuff that we talked about before between three layers of government. We've got to lock that into the land use planning and infrastructure planning. But when we're there and we're clear about what it's all going to service and deliver, my view is you go internationally and say, well, we've got a transport problem or opportunity between Cairns and Tablelands. How might we solve this problem? And I reckon some of the most innovative solutions would come globally on this. And that's why you'll never hear me say we've got to build the Creative Range, right? I reckon we've got to frame up the problem, get it locked into future land use planning, go internationally and say, well, what's the solution? And I could see any sort of possibility from, you've probably seen not the bypass, those structures around Toowoomba Range, the viaducts that are in place there. I mean, that's maybe part of the solution, maybe a bit of innovative tunnelling in the right locations. Maybe we use drone transport more. We're at the stage where in 10 years, drone transport, particularly for large containers, might actually be possible. So if we're not planning like that now, we're going to keep doing what we did nearly 30 years ago now when the first $1 billion proposal for the Creative Range upgrade happened, and we put it off because it cost too much money. And here we are 30 years later, we've still got the same problem, and it is massively constraining growth. So we've got to really get that planning in place. We've got to get the partnerships between the feds and the state, but we've got to be really innovative about the solutions as well.
I think the marketing thing is also a factor. I mean, we just had the big road out to Toowoomba, and there was a heap of money pumped into that. And people keep talking about the Creative Range Road, when really they should be talking something like the Cairns Tableland Cape Connector or something like that.
Yeah, but that's why I don't talk about Creative Range Road.
But that's what I mean saying. It comes up with a completely different vision of, just burrowing through the rainforest, but
and by the way, it should be part of the national highway network as well. Yeah, it's a nationally significant piece of transport.
That's right. It's just a small piece of the overall plan, and I suppose that's what I'm talking about. It's something that needs to be marketed better and with better wording because it conjure up a bigger picture. We've gone now, but I'd just like to touch on one thing before we go. Indigenous population and how to get them to benefit from going forward with development, because in a lot of cases, sometimes some developments seem to be conflicted with their interests. So how are we going to manage to bring them into the discussion on larger scale items that definitely delivers them a benefit? And do we need to start talking about freehold land for the Indigenous population of a lot of that crown land, and that's under native title? Is there some sort of benefit that can be long term there with freehold? And I'm very mindful of giving people freehold land and letting them sell it. I mean, it's probably freehold, but a lot of it should be in escrow, if you know what I mean. It's sort of got covenants over it, so you can't just quickly dispose of cash and blow it up, sort of thing. So, but do you think freehold ownership of land would add a different dimension to the setting?
There's a whole heap of different layers to that that question, Bill. So a lot of my history and background actually is in exploring what happens, why many, particularly government investments in economic development in Indigenous communities fail, and nearly always fails on one foundation, in that there's not a genuine partnership between the investment and the community, and so there's different perspectives about what's got to try to be achieved, and no real foundation community development to support people to take the decisions that they need to take about progressing their future. So we've got very much on the government spending side of that, very much a project-based, project by project based approach, rather than a long, hard-haul community development approach. And in the last 20, 30 years, we've been through all of the land reforms through Native Title, Land Act, in Northern Territory, Aboriginal Land Rights Act. People are in a really strong position, a much stronger position than they ever were 5 to 10 years ago, about actually progressing their economic future. Now that starts with Indigenous families, through to Indigenous clans, to tribal groups, or even groups of tribal groups. And I see massive aspiration across those communities about having a better future, coming back to what better is. That means economic development. It means, looking after the natural and cultural assets. It means having real social development, education, health, all those sorts of things. People are extremely aspirational about the future. But we've only just been through these processes where people now have some sense of control and ownership over their resources again, in terms of their responsibilities for their country, or their responsibilities for the land that's been secured under native title deals and other arrangements. And I see right across Northern Australia, Indigenous families, Indigenous clans and tribal groups starting to now get their governance together, so that they've got a united view of what the future looks like, so that not only are they able to progress their own Indigenous-led development, but when other development comes to town, they're in a strong position to negotiate and get really good, not just in employment deals, but equity-based deals in these types of things. So there's no simple answer to the question, but the solution is absolutely that we need to be standing behind traditional owner groups and supporting them to get their planning for the future, to get their governance foundations right, to get their planning for the future right, and to support them with the ability to progress those agendas under their own terms. Embedded in that conversation is questions about tenure, but traditional owner groups have very strongly got solutions to some of those things by actually offering up, whether they're leases or sublease arrangements, or in some case actually deciding to transition to freehold in certain circumstances. They're all tools that are useful, but they come once people have agreed about what the future looks like, and then the tenure reform comes on the back of that planning. And then, of course, investment flows, because there's security. You need security of investment for that type of investment to happen. So I celebrate to a large extent a huge amount of progress I've seen in communities right across the north, but we do very little at the policy level, in my view, about really standing behind the governance of traditional owner organisations. Building, it's a 20, 30-year job ahead of us, 50-year job ahead of us, in supporting those organisations to become strong, have good governance, get good planning in place, and re-enter the economy in a much stronger position than people were maybe 10 to 15 years ago. That's where I see a lot of the development happening in North Australia. It'll be Indigenous-led. And I think in 50 years' time, in my view, some of the strongest economic institutions in Northern Australia will actually be Indigenous organisations, land organisations, or Indigenous tribal organisations. We're just at the start of that process, and we need a much stronger policy agenda to back that up, rather than focusing only on maybe the welfare aspects of Indigenous development.
Right, thanks very much. We'll wind it up there unless we've got some other comments, but I would like to have you back maybe in the new year.
Yeah, we can talk about lots of things tonight.
I'd like to take down the conversation of, well, what projects can we sort of, push towards that are actually long-term benefits, and maybe a little bit in regards to inequity of some projects getting fast-tracked versus other projects sort of having all the hurdles thrown in front of them, and maybe a little bit on the environment and where it's been weaponized in some instance to halt development, and in a lot of cases really shooting ourselves in the foot for by weaponizing the environment aspects, because regardless of what people think, Australia's quite a rugged sort of land, and yeah, it's got beauty spots, but gee whiz, there's a lot of areas could do with the help of a bit of human engineering and imagination. And yeah, I don't think we should just say, well, take the human element away from the environment and it's a better place. I don't think that's necessarily true in all instances.
Yeah, well, it's probably a good place for me to finish up, Bill. Just in summary, I obviously a passionate North Australian. I think we are located in one of the most fantastic parts of the world. Our relationship is out there, not down there. And I can see a great future if we get this right. This is why I'm an advocate of trying to get this stuff right? Because if we focus purely on extractive development in the sense of not trying to get development deliver inclusive and environmentally sensitive growth, we'll muck up the foundation environmental and natural assets we've got, and we'll stuff up our economy. If we focus purely on protection of the entire landscape, we won't have an economy. We won't be able to build a strong economy. And if we don't really focus on Indigenous-led development, we're going to have deep inequity into our future, which will not be good for our future for anyone. So if we get that right, we've got a great future. If we get it wrong, we're heading towards a failed state. And I don't want to see North Australia become a failed state.
No, well, it's wealthy economies that can protect the environment. It's poor economies that can tend to rape and pillage their environment. To develop it all. But just before we go, if I could just share one screen.
Yep.
This is one of our greatest assets in Northern Australia, and if you can see from the Timor Sea runoff, Carpentaria runoff, and basically the Coral Sea runoff. If you take Tasmania out of the equation, there's probably 75% of all rainfall is in Northern Australia. We have to be able to make something of that, won't we? Is that not one thing that we can?
Well, maybe that's our next talk, Bill.
Next conversation. Because one thing I'd really like to talk to you
next year.
Is the Ord River project. If you've got a bit of background on that, or someone in background on that, but what it was intended or hoped to be, and what it has become, and the shortfall that it is. But it still has a lot of potential. We just probably haven't got the right mix of people up on the land there. So, like I say, thanks very much for your time tonight. If you just stay on the line, I'll just wind up the show and introduce next week's conversation.
Yeah, okay. I'll just hang on. Thanks, Bill.
Right. Thanks, Allan. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, follow and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube page. Next week, we'll have on Richard Urquhart. He's a professor from Monash University, and he'll be talking on the carbon economy, basically the improvement in soil, sequestration of carbon, and he'll also be touching on the methane control in our agricultural industries. So join me next week with Professor Richard Urquhart. Thank you.